You're on mute.
So it appears when you did that the fancy thing with the share, it may have killed your microphone.
Okay, and am I now in the fancy sharing?
Got you now. We've got you sharing as well. Fine.
Okay. All right. Okay. So welcome everyone. And today we've got 10 minutes to talk about enhancing your communication skills, which, as you know, is probably going to be a big ask. So I've focused on something that I think might be useful for any kind of environment. It's useful for both business as well as personal life. And so I might be sharing some things here that you're already familiar with, so bear with me. I don't know who's watching this and how much they know. Okay, so today's topics are what are actually the elements of communication? What's the importance of rapport? How do we share information? And how can we ask questions that really make a difference? And then, of course, there are questions. So the elements of communication are very simple, and you know which ones they are, right? So anybody wants to contribute, please feel free. Alan.
What was ask the question again? Because I've been watching.
What are the elements of communication? What makes up communication?
Well, it's going to be the words themselves, the tone of the words, and all the body language as well, all the non-verbals.
Exactly. Okay. Now, anybody except Alan would like to hazard a guess which one of those make up the biggest part?
Body language.
And Neville, I should have said.
Body language.
Thank you, Jay. Okay. So body language, 55%. All right. What about the rest? What comes next? No Neville, no anybody who knows about this.
Vocal tone.
Yeah, tonality.
Tonality.
How many percent?
Oh, about 30.
So a measly 7% make up words of communication. So that means we live in a world where we communicate with Slack, with email, Slack, the channel, not with Slack, the attitude, but that too, per email, per messenger, per social media, and it's all in writing. And a lot of that miscommunication happens because we misunderstand words. And we cut out the body language, we cut out the tonality. And even on Zoom, it's more difficult because we cut out half of the body. We can't really see. A lot of people don't use their arms. Whereas when we talk in real life, we often gesture, we move our bodies. I'll talk about that in a minute. So body language consists of facial expressions. We don't smile. A smile is misleading. A smile just means we have the corners of our mouth turned up. You live in Asia, you know that a smile could disguise anger. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can express emotions, but facial expressions is dependent on how well we know somebody and how well we can detect the pattern. So this is where I would highly recommend doing Alan's course, because he will teach you how to do all of that. Eye contact, again, also a cultural thing. In some cultures, you don't want to stare at somebody. It's considered to be very impolite. But it's in our world, in the Western world, in Australia, eye contact is really important. So when you talk to somebody and they move their head around a lot and they avoid eye contact, that's generally perceived as somebody who's not quite trustworthy, or as somebody who's insecure, or. I mean, there are all sorts of explanations for that. Gestures have all sorts of meanings depending on which culture you're in, can have all sorts of different things. This could be meaning one thing, this could be meaning something completely different. Be careful which one you use, because it could mean the opposite of what you intend to say. So there are all sorts of things, but we gesture in an ongoing way. We never really sit still. So body postures means we can sit sideways, and I'll talk about that in a minute. When we move around a lot and we only gesture with one hand, it indicates something to people. So when we're talking to people, we want to aim for something that's fairly symmetrical. Breathing, really, really important. So breathing is also a way in which we communicate with people. So when you breathe up high and rapidly, you're actually teaching people or showing people that you're fairly stressed out. Deep and long breaths actually are a sign that you're fairly relaxed. So there are all sorts of different ways in which we communicate completely non-verbally what's going on. And that's more than half of the way in which we half of our communication tools. Okay, so why is this so important, especially for body language? Because it builds rapport. When we build rapport, we minimize unconscious differences. And these differences allow us then to communicate and build that trust. So I don't know if you've seen these metronomes, that if you go to YouTube and have a look, there are all these tests where they've got lots and lots of metronomes. And what they do is they swing them all at random, and then they let them go. And within 2 minutes, they will have all harmonized. They will all go in the same rhythm to the same side. They will all move in the same way. And that's what we do physically when we meet other people and we build trust and rapport. So the fastest way to create that is by breathing. So when you breathe at the same rate as somebody, you create unconscious rapport. Now, saying that, if somebody is really stressed out, you don't want to breathe like them, but you can calm it down. You can meet somewhere in the middle. So rapport is about minimizing differences. It's not about dragging somebody into your world. It's meeting somewhere in the middle where you both feel comfortable. So as I said before, the fastest way to get into rapport is by blinking and having, and actually when people are really deeply in rapport, they have the same heart rate. So we literally create physical alignment when we trust someone. And when we talk about doing business, when we talk about building relationships, trust is the most important thing, other than, keeping our word and, all of these things that come with that. We can create that trust by aligning ourselves physically with somebody. So next time you talk to somebody, also with your family, and you have an important topic to discuss, align your body language. So bring yourself into that unconscious rapport. Tonality. Very briefly, I'm going to keep this very short. Volume, pitch, volume, really loud, really low, pitch really high or really low. Tempo, I can speak really, really quickly, or I can speak really, really slow. This is one of the things. Tempo and pitch and volume are really, really important, because they show somebody else also how stressed we are, or how much whether we're in fight flight or whether we're in a relaxed state. So I know that when I get stressed out, my pitch goes up, my tempo goes up, and I develop a timbre that's fairly sharp. Whereas when I'm relaxed, I have a much softer timbre. It's more rounded. So notice what your voice is like when you talk to somebody. And when somebody talks to you in that high-pitched, really stressed out voice, you can bring them down by lowering your voice, and please do not say calm yourself down. Do this non-verbally. Never use the word calm down, because that's going to create exactly the opposite. So you can do a lot of non-verbal stuff before you even get to words. So the best way to do this is you still and sit and stand in what's called the posture of excellence. Now that means you're aligned, you don't slouch, you don't hang back. When you're on Zoom, you make sure you're pretty much the same size. So not one person way back and one person straight in the screen. That really makes a difference. You match the angle when you're sitting and standing. So you see these two women are aligning their body posture. You match the breathing, and you match the size of the gestures. There's nothing worse than when you're talking to somebody and somebody gestures like this, and the other person sits really calm and very still. And then match the voice. So if you can possibly do that, this is really important when you talk to somebody on the phone. Now, let's get to words very quickly. I know this is a lot, but it's really not. You do all of this already. So when we communicate, when we gather information, we come in through all the senses. So visual, auditory, kinesthetic, gustatory, or olfactory, which is seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling. So these are all the senses that we use when we take in information. Then what we do is we think about this information, and we reduce what we think about, because there's only so much we can take in. So you may remember when we talked about attention, there was so much information out there, but our brains can only focus on a very small part. So then we think, and then we share the information, and out pops one thing, one word. So let give you an example. Let's say last night was pouring rain, and you took in you went for a walk, and somebody says to you, wasn't the weather really wonderful? And you go back to what you thought about it, and you come to the conclusion that it was awful, and you go, no. But the image that the person has in their mind might be completely different to what you had in mind, because they had a very dry garden and they loved the fact that it was watered. So what we remember and what we say is not necessarily in alignment. So often what we do is we create a lot of misunderstandings, because what we do with words, we delete, we distort, and we generalize. And you know this. You never help me with things, right? Or we distort things in the way that we perceive them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the other person sees it that way. So compared to somebody, like, no, it doesn't compare at all. And then we say, then we drop out words because we assume that the other person knows what that word is. So I'll give you an example in a minute of that. So here's a scenario, okay? If I give you this sentence, he always went faster. Does that make any sense?
Faster compared to what?
Yeah, okay. So there are different questions that we can ask in this context. So let me tell you a very quick little story. My father, when he was still alive, used to drive his car on the motorway or the freeway or the Autobahn in Germany at very, very high speed. And he would always drive on the left hand in the fast lane, and he would always have his blinker on his left indicator, so which would be a sign for everybody to get out of the way. And he would use his light horn as well. He was a crazy driver, and he always went faster. So he generally drove at about 200, 220 kilometers an hour. So in the context of that sentence, of that story, he always went faster, makes sense. But this is what we do, is we drop information out and we assume that everybody knows that. Who is he? I've had conversations with people who just kept referring to he and she. And if I hadn't asked, they would have never mentioned who that person was, because they assumed that I knew them. So what we do is we ask who first and foremost, and then he always, that's a generalization if I've ever heard one. You always late. So check that, always. And then went, to go is a neutral verb that doesn't mean anything. He could go by skateboard, for all I know at this point, right? So, and faster compared to what, as Alan said. So check when you get into a place where you don't know what's going on, just go and check, what does the person actually mean? Because assumptions create all sorts of mind reading. They create frustration. They create confusion, misunderstandings, and drama, because we assume that we all share the same meaning of something. And all it does is these assumptions, and we all know the saying that goes behind that, really makes a difference. So don't just go into why somebody says something, but what are they actually saying? Check the words. I'm sure Jeanette will do this when she writes contracts all the time. What is the meaning of the word you want to use? And when you work with somebody, so what specifically are you talking right now? So this is how you do this. So you ask who specifically, how specifically, compared to what specifically, always, never, and sometimes when or where specifically. So the important thing about this is that you sprinkle this into the conversation. You do not, if you use this when somebody talks to you and you ask specifically all the time, it will start to sound like an interrogation. So it's really important that you do this in this, I really need to know the meaning behind this word in order to make sense of this conversation. But when you do this and you use the word specifically, you're going to be amazed at how much information the person volunteers. I mean, instead of just saying, if somebody says we went on holidays, and you say, oh, where did you go? They will say, oh, we went to, point out a generic, like we went to Asia or we went to China or whatever it might be. Where specifically did you go will probably generate the whole itinerary. So there's a whole way in which you can use this to get more information from people. And it's when you do this with the aligned body language and with the aligned tonality, you will find that you have high quality information. You will avoid misunderstandings and avoid all sorts of drama and conflict. which is a really, really important skill to have in any area of life. So thank you for your attention. And if you'd like to have more of a chat with me, then please feel free to give me a call or book in for a call.
Thank you.